great. Well, thank you for joining today for the Solar Electric Systems 101. I'm Elizabeth Youngblood, and I'm a Senior Program Manager at the Amass CEC. Today, we'll be giving an overview of solar PV basics of Amass CEC, as well as available incentives, additional resources, and answering your questions. So the Amass CEC is a public state agency focused on economic development and growing the clean energy economy. We provide investments to clean energy startups, workforce development, supporting innovation and industry support efforts, increased deployment of commercially available technologies, and community engagement with a number of different organizations. Solar PV basics. Solar PV is short for solar photovoltaics, photo meaning light, voltaics meaning electricity. I'm going to take a quick step back though and just talk about energy in general around the world. We consume around 16 terawatt years of energy per year as a world every year, and over to the right are the finite number of energy reserves that we are aware of across the world, including coal, uranium, petroleum, that's ANWR up in Alaska, natural gas, and then we have renewable energy resources. This is what we are aware of that are available on an annual basis, which includes wind, waves, ocean thermal energy current, biomass, hydro, geothermal, and tides. And you can kind of take a quick look back and forth between the amount of energy that's consumed on the left and the amount that is available, both kind of finite reserves as well as renewable reserves. And then there is solar, which is a tremendous resource, and there's more solar energy that hits the earth every day than is consumed in the world in a year. So it's just a matter of finding ways to capture that resource and use it. So it may be that a lot of solar energy hits the earth every day, but what about Massachusetts? Do we have enough solar hitting us to make a solar electric system an economic option here? And the answer is that we don't get as much sun as the Southwest, but if you look in the kind of far right corner, there is Germany, which receives less sun than anywhere in the United States, including Alaska, and yet they're able to, they've installed quite a bit of solar. They're one of the highest installation countries in the world, and so if they can do it, we can as well. Something else to be aware of is residential electricity prices. Massachusetts has very relatively high electricity prices compared to the rest of the United States. In 2017, we were the 5th highest, and kind of around us you can see Connecticut, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, kind of our New England states, and this is in part because we are at the end of the energy pipeline, so we don't have a lot of native resources in our backyard. There isn't coal, there isn't oil. So it can take a bit to get those resources to us. We also have a older grid infrastructure, and so it is constantly needing to be upgraded as well. The chart over to the right is looking at residential electricity rates in Massachusetts, or in New England actually, over the past 20 years or actually, 20 years or so. And you know, it's not a constant up or a constant down, but what you're seeing is on average about a 3% increase in the cost of electricity over time, which is likely to be ongoing over time. So this is looking at some of the trends in residential solar over time. Over to the right, what you're seeing are bars showing the amount of projects, residential scale projects that have been installed in Massachusetts over the past 15 years or so. The orange line is showing the average cost for solar, which has dropped pretty dramatically over time. And essentially, as costs have come down, we've seen that adoption has gone up in kind to meet the demand. So another way to look at this is in a map form. This is looking in 2005 when there were under 300 projects, maybe about 5 or 6 megawatts installed. We've seen, as I said, a bit of an uptick in 2015, about 43,000 systems. And in 2018, mid-2018, there was 85,000 systems. Right now, in early 2019, I shouldn't say early, this is mid-2019 at this point, we're well over 90,000 systems, over 2,000 megawatts installed. So how do solar PV panels work? The key takeaway is that they need direct sunlight. Because the sunlight, the photons from the sun hit the panel and they dislodge electrons in a layer of silicon, and the electrons will flow through that, through a layer to a place where the electrons are needed, and it will create a circuit. So taking a look at this solar PV array, we've got the panels, which are typically on a roof, though they can be pole or ground mounted. They are producing electricity in what is called direct current, or DC, that is then brought to an inverter, which converts the electricity from DC to AC, or alternating current, which is used in the home. The electricity is then brought into the electrical panel of the home and is used on site. If there's any excess electricity, that is brought through what's called a net meter and is metered off onto the grid. The net meter will then, quote unquote, spin backwards and provide credits that can be used either later in the night or feasibly later on in a month where there might not be as much sun. Something to note here that when the grid is down, the solar PV array, unless it has a battery backup system, it will also turn off. And this is something that is built into the inverter. It's called anti-islanding. So in a situation, let's say it's the middle of the day and the lights and everything are turned off in the home, and the grid is down and electricity, let's say the system is operating and electricity is going back onto the grid, that can be a dangerous situation for power line workers, for example. And so if the grid is down, the system will shut off without a battery backup system. So let's break down the solar PV system a little bit more. The key components of solar PV system include the modules. They're built out with this kind of usually about 72 cells that go into a panel or a module, either way that works. The modules are then tied into what's called an array. They're usually wired in series. As mentioned before, they might be part of a roof or pole-mounted system. The electricity goes then through either what's called a central inverter. The picture above right is a central inverter, or can be connected to what are called microinverters, which each inverter might be tied to the back of each solar panel. There's also something out there which is a little bit of a combination of both. It is a central inverter with what are called DC optimizers. That is also something that we've seen is very common in Massachusetts as well. Some other meters that are on site include a revenue grade meter. This is something that is essentially counting the amount of electricity that is generated only in a forward direction, so it's just constantly moving forward. We talked briefly about the utility net meter that will go forward and backwards depending on how much is produced versus how much is consumed. Also on site is an external disconnect switch, something that is required for all solar PV systems, and you might potentially see batteries on site as well. That is starting to become more common. So when talking about electricity, some things to be aware of is that the system size of a solar PV system is measured in watts. So let's say, for example, a typical solar PV panel might be a 300-watt panel. If you then put together 10 of those panels, you'll have 3,000 watts, also known as 3 kilowatts. If you add together multiple kilowatts, you will then have a megawatt. So we'll talk about this a little bit later, but the average size system, residential scale in Massachusetts, is about an 8,000 watt or 8 kilowatt size system. On the other hand, electricity usage and production is measured in what are called watt hours, kilowatt hours, or megawatt hours. So this is based on how much electricity is produced by the system. You would say that a 10 kilowatt system might produce X number of kilowatt hours a year or a day or something like that. But just to be aware that there is a little bit of a difference there. Great. So this is looking at an image to the left of what an electric bill might look like, where in the kind of early months, December, January, February, there might be the customer might receive a bill, but starting in March, April, May, June, you might see that the customer is actually developing a credit. They're producing more electricity than they're consuming, and they're getting this credit on their bill. It's not showing here specifically, but then as soon as July and August comes along, let's say the customer has been turning on their fan or their AC, they might see a jump in their electricity usage, and that's where that credit can then be useful in a later month. So these are just some data points that might be of interest. The average Massachusetts home uses about 7,500 kilowatt hours of energy per year. As I said earlier, that the average system in Massachusetts is about 7,000 watts. It's kind of edged up a little bit now to 8,000 watts, but assuming that around 7,000 to 8,000 watts or kilowatts, or 7 kilowatts, I should say. One of the key things when an installer engages a customer is they will check the electric bill to see what is the electricity demand on the site, how much is that customer using. And they will use that to kind of figure out what the size of the system will be to meet the needs of that customer. At the very bottom, this is a bit of a back of the envelope calculation, but Mass CC does receive a lot of data on electricity production of solar PV systems, both residential and commercial. So as kind of a very high level rule of thumb, and lots of caveats, and we'll talk about this in the next couple of slides, but a 1 kilowatt system will produce approximately 1,100 kilowatt hours per year. So if you look up a little higher, if you look at that 7 kilowatt system, it might produce 7,700 kilowatt hours per year, which would then meet the needs of that average Massachusetts home, as an example. So what makes a good site for solar? So southern exposure is ideal, though east and west facing roofs can also work. There's not much sun that can hit the panels if it's facing north. That's kind of focused away from the sun. One thing to be aware of is, a question that we receive often is, well, wouldn't you want to have the solar panels lying flat on the roof to capture the sun? And the response to that is that would make a lot of sense if we were right along the equator and the sun was directly above us. But we are further north, and so kind of the ideal scenario would be to have the panels tilted towards the latitude. So here in Boston, it's about 43 degrees is latitude here, but really anywhere between 30 and 45 is ideal for panels. And in Massachusetts, that's actually very typical for a roof. A lot of roofs are built such that the snow can shed and things like that. So you'll find that many roofs are in this space as well. Something also that's very important is 4 to 6 hours of direct sunlight. There's definitely a lot of trees in New England and a lot of shady roofs. So this is something to definitely take into consideration. We'll talk a little bit about that as well. Open roof area as well, around about 100 square feet per kilowatt. So again, to get to that 7 kilowatt average size system, you would need about 700 square feet of space. However, it might be that if you don't have a good roof, you might think about a ground or pole mounted system. This is actually taking a look at the impact of the orientation and the tilt of the roof and how that can impact how much electricity is produced. So this is looking at, this is for Boston, Massachusetts. If you have a south-facing roof, perfectly south-facing, 180 degrees, and if you have a tilt of the roof that is 30 to 45 degrees, we said that was kind of optimal. You can see over to the right that gets you to kind of 99 to 100% of an optimally sited system. That's kind of that's the perfect zone of what a system would produce very well at. With that in mind, homes are built in various ways, and they're not all facing perfectly south with that perfect tilt. So there can be scenarios where, for example, if you have a west-facing roof or east-facing, at 90 or 270 degrees, it certainly can impact the amount of electricity produced, but it might still be that it's a good value proposition. This is something that an installer will work with a customer on and say, okay, well, this is a west-facing roof, and it's going to produce about maybe 75 or 80% of an optimally sited system, but it might be that the economics are still a good value proposition for that customer. Great. Let's talk also a bit about shading. As I mentioned, the solar panels need the photons from the sun. It is an electrical circuit that is creating that electricity. And so one thing to be aware of is that the actual panels themselves are very, very sensitive to any sort of shading, whether that be tree shading or even electrical lines to a certain extent, even though they're a bit smaller and less impactful. But this is just an image at the bottom to take a look at. If you look at the lower right, if a solar PV panel has one cell out of that 72 cells I mentioned that's shaded, it could stop a portion of the circuit from moving forward and cause half of the power from that module to stop working. If you look over to the left, if you looked at a PV panel, you might see that those are where the bus bars are. That's where the circuits are starting and ending there. So if you were to cut off those four cells at the bottom, that might actually just cause that PV panel to stop producing electricity in total and completely. As it was mentioned, there are DC optimizers and what are called those microinverters. And let's say if there's a bit of shading on one panel, but the rest are unshaded, then those other panels can continue to produce electricity unencumbered by that one panel that might not be operating. So typically when an installer is looking at a home, they might be talking to a customer and just getting a sense of the home from an aerial view from a Google Earth or something like that. The next thing that they're going to do is take a look at and perform what's called a shading analysis. This can be done online through kind of online shading tools that are available, or they might come to the home and actually perform an on-site shading analysis. The one to the right is an example of an on-site analysis. This is looking at, if you look at the kind of far left, that is early in the morning, going all the way to for 6 o'clock in the evening to the far right. And then if you look at the lines going from bottom, that's July, May, April, March, February, January, December at the very top. So this is actually looking at where the sun is going to be coming overhead throughout the entire year. And what you can see for this particular home and this particular location with this picture is that in the afternoon, starting at around 2 to 3 o'clock, there's going to be a lot of tree shading. And so if there's a panel, a solar PV panel at this particular location, it's going to be shaded starting in the kind of early afternoon hours. These are some common barriers to be aware of for residents when they're considering solar. And you can kind of think of these as going from those that can be more easily overcome to those that are a little bit more difficult, and then kind of ending with not feasible by the installer. So the first is really just inertia. You know, maybe they're very interested in installing solar, but you know, it's one of 100 things they're thinking of. You know, anecdotally, we've heard from a number of installers that, you know, someone might start thinking about solar and do some research, and they might reach out to an installer, and it might take, you know, 2-3 years or plus for someone to kind of go through that process and decide to pull the trigger and install. Something that we hear of from time to time certainly is aesthetics, wanting to know what that solar PV array is going to look like on their roof, whether it's on the front or the back of their home. I think this has changed a bit over time as we've been seeing more and more solar PV systems installed, both kind of commercially and residentially. Understanding incentives and payback is another piece too. And you know, sometimes that can be seen as somewhat complex. There is we're going to be talking about this later, but a different stack of different types of incentives, and you know, how do those come together and make it a good value proposition for the customer. If the customer is considering buying the system outright, there's the upfront financial cost, and whether they want to pay with cash or if they want to pay with some sort of a loan product, that's something that they'll want to consider. They might be unsure about their time in the residence, so it might be that the payback for a solar PV array might be in the kind of 6 to 8 year time frame. If they're looking to move before that, you know, that might be something that they're concerned about. Other things, trees, dormers, structural issues will add cost and can, you know, in some ways it can actually reduce the production of the system. If you, you know, you've got trees or you've got piping that's coming out and it's making the system not produce as much electricity as it should. There could be structural problems. We'll talk about this in the next slide, but where you know, the rafters need to be reinforced, and so those things can add costs. And then lastly, and this one really is certainly a barrier, is if the installer is saying, you know, this unfortunately is not a good site for solar. there's too much shading, there's not enough roof space, there's some other issue with it, and they're saying it's not feasible. And examples like this, there's other options potentially, whether it's energy efficiency or other clean heating and cooling options or things like that we'll talk about a little later as well. So these are just a few examples of what could add cost to an installation. As was just mentioned, reinforcing the rafters. A number of homes in Massachusetts are older, and so they were built perhaps under a building code that required the rafters to be, that meet certain requirements that they met at the time, but things have changed with regards to snow loading and other things. So even though the panels themselves and the kind of PV array might only add, if it's just kind of, if it's the standard array, if it's on kind of, it's not ballasted, so it's not on a flat roof, but if it's, at an angled roof, that might add 1 to 3 pounds of weight. About the same as if you added another layer of shingles. It may be that the roof needs to be reinforced just because it was built at a time where it may need to have been reinforced anyway. There might be multiple different arrays, so if there's different roof angles, it might be that there might be some small cost with having different arrays with different piping for the wires and stuff like that. If it's a standing seam metal roof, that could potentially add cost. If it's a very steep roof, the installer might need to put up scaffolding or things, extra protection measures as well. On the electrical side, this is also similar to the older home. There might be that there needs to be service upgrades. If the amp is a 100 amp service, it might need to be upgraded. The electrical panel, it might be full, and so they need to do a sub panel or things like that. Those are all things that an installer will look at and provide guidance on. Other examples, a ground or pole mounted system tends to add cost because there is both kind of putting in the kind of underground framing of whatever it is, whether it's some sort of geotech or cement base or things like that to kind of keep it in place, and then the trenching underground of the wiring can be expensive as well. We typically tend to see ground and pole mounted systems a little bit west of the city, kind of getting into central and western Mass, and that's in part because there's larger lawns and larger kind of yard space, and there might be more open land as well. So, if we were mentioning tree shading before on the roof, you can imagine if you put the PV array on the ground, that the trees are going to be that much higher, so that can really impact a PV array. So that's just typically what we see is we tend to see more pole and ground mounted systems out a little further in the western state. Data acquisition system, this is something that for smaller systems, it might be something that it's an optional upgrade where they can, automatically, combine the data together. There might be other visualizations that gives you instant feed of information, things like that. The installer might offer an extended warranty, whether that be through equipment warranty, or even just their service warranty as well. And then I list this here, increased shading. This is for third-party owned systems, but typically, and we'll talk about third-party owned in a minute, that's our next piece here, but if there's more shading, that the third-party company does want to make their money back, and so they might charge a higher cost per for the electricity that they're generating to make up that difference. Great. So I've got a small section here on ownership types. As was mentioned, I mentioned third-party ownership. That's one of 2 different ownership types. There is outright purchase, where the customer owns the system outright. They've purchased it, whether they bought it with cash or with a loan or something like that. And then there's what's called third-party ownership. This may be either what's called a lease or a power purchase agreement. There's a little bit of a difference here. The lease is essentially the customer agrees to a monthly fee that they will pay to the third-party owner, third-party company, and they will then receive all the electricity that the system generates every month for no additional cost. Typically, these arrangements are set up so that there is a minimum amount of electricity that the customer will receive every year, and if they don't meet that minimum amount, they might get some sort of a payment from that third-party company. So there is some kind of risk mitigation there for the amount that you might be paying per month. Might be, say, for example, $50. That over the course of a period of time that you will make a certain amount back. So that is a good value proposition. Power purchase agreement. Essentially, you've agreed to buy the power at a certain prefixed amount. Typically, this is lower than the utility rate. So let's say if the utility electricity rate is, I'm just going to say 21 cents a kilowatt hour, they might be charging 17 cents a kilowatt hour or something like that, maybe in the kind of 10 to 15% savings or maybe more. It really kind of depends on the site. But you agree to buy any of the power generated, and then if there's any additional electricity that you consume beyond what the PV array produces, then you would pay that to the utility. So this is taking a look, this is actually another way of looking at the numbers of solar PV systems installed in Mass. This is, again, residential or small scale systems, 15 kilowatts and less. If you look here, the blue is third-party owned systems, and the green is direct purchase. And so if you look at 2018, this is through the end of last year, it's about a 40-60 split. So about 40% direct ownership and 60% third-party ownership in the state. So a little bit more about what the difference is between direct ownership and third-party ownership. These are more questions for probably kind of homeowners should be asking these questions, but who buys and owns the system? Direct ownership, it's a homeowner. Third-party ownership, third party owns it. Are there any upfront costs for the customer? If it's direct ownership, yes, so they can pay with cash or a home equity line of credit or a solar loan. Third-party ownership, it's typically a low or no upfront cost scenario. Who takes advantage of the state and federal incentives? Typically, this is the homeowner who takes advantage, as well as on the third-party ownership side, the third-party owned company. There's a few nuances there. There might be scenarios where if you have a third-party owned project, you might have some sort of an agreement where you get the incentives. There's also certain scenarios where you might own the system, but then there's a company that's willing to kind of pre-buy some of the incentives. There are certain things out there. I wouldn't say they're particularly common, but that's why I'm putting generally homeowner, generally third party. Who is responsible for maintenance and insurance? The homeowner or third-party company. Typically, the maintenance on a solar PV system is relatively low. There's no moving parts. If there's a central inverter, it might be that those typically have about a 10-year warranty or so, and so it's not uncommon for a customer to need to replace that inverter one time during the life of the system. So another thing is, and we're going to talk about this, the impact of solar on property value. So Fannie Mae, which is one of the federal lending, or not lending per se, but mortgage entities out there, defines solar as a real property, and it can add value to a home. There are national lab studies as well as what's called the PV value tool, which is a resource that real estate agents can use and also appraisers in determining the contributory value of solar to a home. On the third-party ownership side, it's the guidance from Fannie Mae is that it's considered personal property because it's not owned by the customer. There was a study by Lawrence Berkeley National Lab that found there was no evidence of negative impact on the value of a home. Point of sale, what to clarify with the realtor. The key thing is on the owned system side is that if there are any ongoing incentives, so if a system is installed and it received a SREC, or came under the SREC program, or if it's coming under the current SMART incentive program, that the customer let the sales or the realtor know this, and so that they can build that into the sale process, that the new customer takes on these incentives, and then that's part of the value proposition. On the third-party ownership side, this is something, usually the third-party ownership company has what's called a UCC1 filing. Largely what this means, typically what happens is they will, if there is, if the person has a loan on the home, or I should say a mortgage, the third-party company needs to be contacted. They will take their UCC1 filing off until the new mortgage is set up, and then they will then resubordinate under that mortgage. And that's something that certainly a realtor will ask about. One of the first questions they might ask is this an owned or a leased system or third-party owned system? So I think that there's, I think that's, people are pretty aware of that at this point. Great. So just really quickly here, this is one of those studies I mentioned, Selling into the Sun by Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. They looked at solar homes that had solar PV as well as those that did not, and they found a very high solar premium for owned systems all across the U.S., including in Massachusetts. It recommends, looking at the value of the energy savings and, and replacement costs to predict the value for the system. So it's, again, looking at contributory value, again, tied into, this is all part of the PV value tool, which is available online if you Google PV value tool. Other research appraising into the sun, similar results as the original study, and then the leasing into the sun, which is the no premium found for systems owned by a third party. So as we mentioned earlier, Massachusetts has high electricity prices, and when you couple that with the reduced cost of solar and the numerous incentives that are available, this can lead to economical solar projects. So this is the stack of incentives that are available. There are federal and state tax incentives. There is net metering and utility bill savings. There is a production incentive called SMART, and there is the Mass Solar Loan Program. So the federal tax incentive is available for both residential and commercial projects. The amount of the incentive is going to be changing at the end of this year, at the end of 2019. So essentially, a taxpayer can claim a tax credit for the total cost of the system. So right now, if a solar PV system, residential scale, gets built in 2019 and is completed by the end of this calendar year, they'll get the 30% tax credit. If they are completed and installed within the 2020 year, they'll get a 26% tax credit. And again, in 2021, it's a 22% tax credit. In Massachusetts, there is a state tax credit of 15%, but it is capped at $1,000. There's also a equipment sales exemption. I believe this is on primary homes only, but your installer can give you further clarification. There's also a property tax exemption for 20 years, if applicable. This is something that each municipality can clarify. Largely, if it's residential scale, they will apply this tax exemption. There are some nuanced scenarios where if there's a big field of solar somewhere, they may not offer this exemption. There might be kind of things like that, but typically for residential, it's the exemption will be applied. Net metering, we mentioned this a little bit earlier, but allows the system owner to export power to the grid. The value for smaller scale systems, that kind of under 10 kilowatt systems, so the majority of residential scale systems, they will receive close to the full retail rate of electricity. So if in the middle of the day some electricity from the system is exported to the grid, they will receive close to the retail rate of that back. If the system is larger than that, they might receive a reduced incentive amount, which is called market net metering. It's about 60% of retail rate. Systems that are over 10 kilowatts that are single phase, or over 25 kilowatts that are three phase, mostly commercial scale, there are kind of caps in place for larger scale systems that are in effect. But as it was mentioned, if it's under 10 kilowatts, typically it is exempted from any sort of net metering cap. So to just be aware of that. All right, the Solar Massachusetts Renewable Target, or SMART program. This was launched late last year in 2018. The program is really focused on supporting the installation of an additional 1,600 megawatts of solar capacity in Massachusetts. It's available to customers in investor-owned utilities, so Eversource, National Grid, and Unitil. There is a separate program for municipal utilities that is not related to the SMART program. To get a sense of what this program is focused on, it provides long-term, well, first of all, you generate the electricity and you receive the value of the electricity plus an additional incentive. The intent is to provide long-term revenue certainty by providing a fixed incentive for the amount of electricity generated. So that doesn't change over time, which is a little bit different than the previous SREC program. So for smaller systems, under 25 kilowatts, they'll receive an incentive over a 10-year period. Larger systems will receive an incentive over 20 years. And that's a lower incentive amount, but over a longer period of time. This is just for larger scale systems, but they get a compensation rate that's set according to the project size, the location, the customer type, and other project attributes, a certain amount. Each block, it's broken out by utility and service territory, and there's both, there's what's called a set aside for small scale 25 kW systems under each block. So it may be that large commercial scale might be moving at a faster rate than residential or small scale, and so they've been kind of separated out and allowed to kind of move at their own pieces. There's a lot of nuance with the SMART program, or a lot of different kind of pieces to it. Just be aware that an installer is really there to be a resource for you and discuss the SMART program with you, and they'll actually be applying for you on your behalf or on behalf of the customer. So that, you know, they will be taking the lead, they'll be having you sign the paperwork, and they'll talk you through it as well. To learn more about the SMART program, there is a website, masmartsolar.com. It's managed by ClearResult, which is the program administrator. There on the website, you can actually see the current incentive block for each utility and service territory. It's something that's available under their resources tab. There's also a much more extensive presentation that's available, but that was created by the Department of Energy Resources. So if you want to delve into, I think it's maybe in the range of 40 or 50 slides or so, you can certainly link to this or click on this and learn a bit more as well. So then there is the Amass Solar Loan Program. This was launched in 2015. It was a $30 million program. We tweaked it a little bit in 2018 and really put the focus on low and moderate income customers, though there are still some kind of benefits for market rate customers as well. So the key features are that the program connects customers purchasing solar, looking to purchase solar, with local lenders who are offering low interest loans. They'll offer fixed loan terms with capped interest rates and closing costs. The lenders use their own lending products, and they follow their standard underwriting process. Mass CEC currently offers 3 types of loan support incentives for income qualified customers. However, if there's a customer that's not income qualified, let's say they're, they kind of are making more per year than the requirements under this program, they can still come through the program and get a solar loan. It just won't be getting any of the loan support incentives. So we do see a certain subset of lenders that are happy to offer their loan product, but they really do like the opportunity to have the vetting from Mass CEC on some of the whether it be shading or other things that we take a look at. So it can be for more than just the kind of low and moderate income customers. So one of the 3 loan support mechanisms is called the income-based loan support, or IBLS. It's an incentive that's paid directly to the loan principal the month following the completion of the solar PV system. So there's 2 different qualifying income categories. And the first one, category 1, is for customers that are below 80% of state median income. They're eligible for a 30% principal reduction of up to $10,500. Category 2 are those that are below 120% of state median income, and they're eligible for a 10% principal reduction of up to $3,500. Additionally, there's an interest rate buy-down, IRBD. This is individuals who are in category 1 are eligible for this, and it's a 1.5% interest rate buy-down for income qualified customers, again, in category 1. This is paid directly to the lenders so that the customer interest rate stays low the entire term of the loan. So one way to look at this is if there is a 6% interest rate, Mass CEC will buy it down by 1.5%, resulting in the customer seeing a 4.5% interest rate. Lastly, there is what's called the loan loss reserve. It's an additional incentive to help those with lower credit scores obtain a loan. It's available for both category 1 and category 2 income qualified customers. And you can kind of see below, for those that have a somewhat lower credit score, Mass CEC will put funds aside for the lender And in the scenario where this individual might, or customer were to default, Mass CEC will pay, for those in loan class B, for example, might pay 80% of the principal, or for loan class C might pay 90% of the principal to the lender. So this might give them a little bit more comfort in deciding to go a little bit beyond their kind of standard credit ranges, which is typically that 720 and above. So this is a little bit more information about the renewable energy tax exemption. This is the language that is written into law at this point. Solar energy systems used as a primary or auxiliary power system for the purposes of heating or otherwise supplying the energy needs of taxable property are exempt from local property tax for a 20-year period. The Department of Revenue gave some additional clarification on this a couple of years ago with the creation of net metering. So feel free to take a look at that. And but largely, again, residential scale systems typically fall within this tax exemption. Home insurance, typically there is little or no increase. So additional resources to be aware of on the Mass CEC website. We do have what's called masscec.com/solar. We have various sections that can be very helpful for residents, including how solar PV works, finding an installer, financing options, cost and performance, incentives and programs, and frequently asked questions. This is a screenshot of the finding the installer or an installer slide, or I should say the page. There are recommended tips and potential questions to ask installers as part of the kind of process of choosing an installer. I just want to step back for a second. I don't think we have, oh yeah. Cost and performance provides, as was mentioned, we do capture a lot of the solar PV systems that are installed across the state. So if you want information about average pricing by county, you can even dig down into number of systems installed in your town and by which installer. That's all available on the cost and performance tab, as well as other things about the different, more detail into the incentives and programs and financing options that are out there. So to learn about installing solar a little bit more, we do have, as I said, the residential page. There is also a residential guide to solar, which was recently updated. It is a 20-25 page document, but some of the pieces in it that are really interesting, aside from many of the things we just covered, is there is a buying and selling homes with solar on it, as well as an expanded storage section as well. We also have a commercial website, kind of tailored towards commercial customers called, that's the masscc.com/commercial solar page. Lastly, there are other things to consider for homeowners, whether they are deciding to do multiple things at once, or we highly recommend considering energy efficiency first and making your electricity demand as low as possible before deciding to install solar or any other technology. So getting a free energy assessment from Mass Save is great. And then doing what you can to increase insulation and things like that to reduce your energy load is tremendous. We also have other web pages on different clean energy technologies, including air source heat pump, ground source heat pump, information about storage and other things, solar hot water and things like that. So definitely take a look at that. And then the More EV Electric Vehicles website, which is an incentive program that's available for electric vehicles. And with that, thank you so much for joining us.